Welcome back to InterMission. I'm Avery Merrill. Sorry about no episode yesterday. I had this script written, but I didn't get a chance to record it, so today you're going to be getting a twofer. And today's script, or this script for this episode, is from Thursday, so our subject is great music. And so we're going to be talking about the four most famous notes in music and why you've probably never heard them played correctly. So let's jump right in. As you might have guessed, the piece of music which we're going to discuss is Ludwig van Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 in C minor, specifically the first movement. And those four notes are the ba-ba-ba-bum that you probably associate with everything menacing and ominous. And so in this episode I'm going to explain some of the features that make this symphony a piece of great music, and then we'll talk about the issue of the interpretation of this piece, which is what I alluded to earlier. Why you've probably been hearing those four notes played incorrectly your entire life. And along the way, I'll be able to sort of elaborate on some of my personal views in terms of musical interpretation. But first, let's just talk about the piece itself. And Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is very interesting because it comes stylistically placed at almost a perfect crossroads between the classical and romantic eras of classical music. And Beethoven himself was a pretty key transitional figure in these two eras. The Fifth Symphony shows some of the ways in which Beethoven drew from his predecessors, but it also shows the ways in which he inspired his successors, those who came after him. Because that was part of the transition that came from classical to romantic, was an emphasis less on some of the formal structures that they used, and more of experimentation and breaking the rules and violation of expectations for dramatic effect. And the first movement is a really good example of both Beethoven's use of the conventional classical forms and the ways in which he was beginning to sort of break out of the classical expectations, the sort of men dressed in tights and wigs, sort of almost stuff. I wouldn't call it stuffiness, but you could certainly make that case. But at any rate, it's more formal, more regular, more controlled, and then the romantic tends to be less, more unpredictable, more romantic, as we would consider it in the modern term, and more violative of sort of the rules and formal procedures of the classical period. So the first movement is in sonata form, which is a concept of musical structure that was one of the primary innovations of the classical period. And this sonata form remained prominent throughout the Romantic era into the late Romantic era, and it has proved to be one of the most durably effective ways of creating a dramatic structure in music. And simply put, sonata form takes place in three parts: contrast, development, and resolution of musical ideas. And so in the sonata form, you're going to begin with an exposition, and this is going to expose or introduce the melodies and themes that will be used throughout the sonata. Usually there's two, and they contrast in mood, texture, and key. So between the two, there will be some sort of transition that brings us out of the home key, which in this case is C minor, and into another key, which in this case is E flat major. The exposition exposes or introduces these themes, and often, as in the Fifth Symphony, it's repeated as well, exactly, like without variation. And that sort of helps to establish the themes for the listener and helps us become more familiar with them before we move on to the development. Because these themes that are introduced in the exposition are going to continue to be important in the development. And because the development is going to take those themes of the exposition and is going to elaborate and expand on them through repetition, through variation, through development of these themes, through contrast, all sorts of transformations that can occur. And the development is generally unstable, at least from a sort of what key is it in perspective, from a tonal perspective. It often changes keys like as frequently as like every few seconds. And the emphasis of the development is that instability, which is in contrast to the exposition, which was largely stable and generally predictable, at least to a greater degree. After the development goes on for a while, and this can depend on the composer and the piece, how long the development takes, it transitions back into what we call the recapitulation. And the recapitulation, in the most sort of basic formal instance, is a repetition of the exposition, but with one major difference, which is that the themes of the exposition are all now in the home key, which in this case is C. So where before they were in C minor and E flat major, they're now in C minor and C major. And that serves as a resolution to both the contrasts that you saw in the exposition and the instability that you had in the development. And often you'll also have, at the end of the recapitulation, a coda which sort of provides a final resolution to the piece. And the Fifth Symphony is an example of the sonata form. It's a pretty good example of sonata form as well. But it also shows some of the rebellious spirit that would characterize Beethoven and many of his romantic followers. All of the characteristic features of the sonata form are present, and you can identify them pretty easily. However, Beethoven also definitely plays with our expectations and uses these violations of expectations to increase the dramatic tension of the piece and make that final resolution all the more powerful. And so the first example of the way that Beethoven plays with our expectations is those first four notes, with the ba-ba-ba-ba, which begin the first theme of the exposition. And from a sort of classical standpoint, we recognize these notes today as iconic, and this probably wouldn't necessarily surprise us about it. But from the perspective of Beethoven's time, probably the most remarkable thing about this theme is how unsteady it is. It's because if you think about a theme like that Mozart would write or that Haydn would write, then you're going to be looking at something that's very square, very steady, very predictable. Whereas Beethoven's theme is constantly charging forward and then stopping suddenly, and it has these dramatic pauses or fermatas, and that sort of creates a contrast within the first theme between that surge emotion and then the sudden pauses, and those which pauses are often seeming to cut things off right when they're getting the most intense. And so that's one way that Beethoven plays with our expositions. And then you have, after that first theme, you have a very quick transition. It's almost a blink and you might miss it transition. And that brings us into E flat major for the second theme, which seems to be which is more lyrical. It's definitely gentler. And then as it reaches its peak, it also seems to have this sort of joyful, powerful resolution. However, that being the end of the exposition, we then get the exposition repeated, and that means that you go immediately back to the ra-pa-pa-pum, and that leads to an even heightened contrast, I would say, between these two themes, as you're sort of getting the darkness of the first theme versus the peace and joy, relatively speaking, of the second theme, and then right back to the first theme and then the second theme again, and that really heightens and sets up the contrast that is going to lead to the dramatic action of the development. And as is often the case, Beethoven's developments are absolutely amazing. They are a masterclass in drama and development in really high quality music. So the development of the Fifth Symphony is largely based on that first theme, particularly the rhythm of the ba-ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-ba-bum, and it really showcases Beethoven's ability to manipulate even such a simple theme in countless different ways. And so you have all kinds of transformations. It goes up, it goes down, it goes left, it goes right, and eventually we arrive at a brief moment where you get a little bit more peace and quiet, so in sort of relative terms. And that moment is then interrupted again by the first movement, by those really powerful rhythms, and then it returns for another second, and then it gets interrupted again, and that brings us back into the recapitulation, that transition. And here again in the recapitulation, we see another example of Beethoven playing with what we expect to happen, because instead of just repeating the exposition exactly, or the first theme literally, he inserts sort of a free-flowing solo for the oboe. It's really a sad melodic line that provides one of the few real moments of rest or pause in this piece, in this movement. And then after that, it's back into the fray of the main theme, and that sets us up for the transition to the second theme again, which this time, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be in C major. And the end of the recapitulation sets us up for the coda, which begins almost immediately with the resolution of the recapitulation, and suddenly goes into D flat major before just as suddenly taking us back into the original home key of C minor for the sort of final battle. And this is typical of Beethoven, but the coda, I mentioned earlier, as sort of something to tie a nice little bow on everything and just to wrap things up. That is not what Beethoven did with the coda. Beethoven treats the coda almost like a second development. And this coda is really the culmination of the entire piece, the dramatic struggle that you feel when you're listening to this piece. And that coda continues for well over a minute. It introduces what's basically a new theme, and it continues to develop the original theme in all kinds of ways. And then one final all-out statement of that first original theme leads to the close of the piece in an overpowering C minor cadence. So that's the movement at the glance. That's Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, at least the first movement at a glance. But I also want to say a little bit more about this piece, because as I mentioned, I think this movement is almost always played incorrectly. But really, you might be thinking that's ridiculous. What would I know? How could that be so? And in order to answer that question, I first have to talk a little bit about what it actually means to play a piece of music correctly. So, first off, let's sort of give a couple of extreme cases to show why those might be incorrect. We could, on the one hand, give a computer a piece of sheet music, plug in the parameters and the notes and the tempo and the key, and have it give us like a MIDI performance or whatever, something that we might consider technically a perfect performance. But we would also all agree that that performance isn't really perfect, because it would be robotic, it would lack some humanity to it. And so if you're just talking about strict and flawless and robotic adherence to the letter of the sheet music, that's not the answer to what it means to play a piece of music correctly. On the other hand, we do have to agree that what is in the sheet music has something to do with a correct performance, because we'd all agree that a performer who changes the notes, rewrites passages he doesn't like, ignores the dynamics, he's obviously playing it incorrectly as well. And so, obviously, you can't just say, ignore what's in the sheet music, but you're not just going to say, do exactly what's in the sheet music like a robot. Neither of those is going to be correct. So what is sort of the middle ground between those two options, and what does that look like in real life, specifically with regards to the Beethoven Fifth Symphony? So here's what I would say. Here's what I believe. So when we read a piece of sheet music, we're looking at the composer's best attempt to record his or her intentions and visions for this piece of music that he or she has composed in a communicable form. And so the correct interpretation of a piece is going to be one that looks at the sheet music and looks at the intentions that are decipherable from the sheet music and tries to realize those intentions and vision to the greatest degree possible. So what does that actually mean? What are the ramifications of that idea? Well, first off, it generally means that we accept whatever is in the sheet music, whatever is written there, as an accurate reflection of the way the composer composed the piece. So when I say that when Beethoven wrote forte, he meant forte. He did not mean fortissimo. He did not mean piano. He did not omit a decrescendo. He did not omit a retardando or a fortissimo just because he was being careless or anything. If he wrote one thing, he did not mean another thing. At the same time, there are some concessions that I would make to avoid sort of that robotic interpretation that I talked about earlier. First off, there are obviously nuances to phrasing, to rubato, to dynamics, to climaxes, to all that stuff. And you can't perfectly write that down. Even the best composer cannot perfectly write down exactly what he wants to be played as far as those things go. And therefore, we're free to add those in insofar as they're consistent with the structure that we can see. So that's to say that we're not going to be changing a forte to a piano, like I said earlier, but we might make a particular moment in the phrase more forte than another in order to make it sound more natural. And then there's also cases in which, in certain cases, the sheet music as written might fail to capture completely the intentions of the composer. And that might be just because the composer didn't think it was necessary because they thought that a musician might think it was obvious. The obvious example of this would be pedaling as a pianist, which is even in especially in later composers, you're not going to see pedal annotated very often, but it's often assumed because it just is simply so obvious that the composer would want pedal that it's not necessary, unless there's something unusual or counterintuitive, some effect that he wants to achieve with the pedal. He's not necessarily going to write down everything because that can just be tedious and pedantic. And so we might be comfortable making these kinds of interpretive decisions if they're contrary to the explicit letter of what's in the sheet music, but we believe that they're consistent with the intentions that the composer was trying to communicate, and the composer would have considered those sorts of interpretive decisions obvious or reasonable to any good musician. And so, enough with the hypotheticals, though. What does this actually look like in regards to Beethoven's Fifth? And with this specific piece, and with a lot of Beethoven's work, and even beyond Beethoven, really, one of the most interesting aspects of this sort of theory of interpretation that I have has to do with tempo, the tempo that Beethoven gives for this piece. And the metronome was invented relatively late in Beethoven's life. He actually went back after the invention of the metronome and gave metronome marks to all of his symphonies which had previously been written, which included all of them but the ninth, which would later be given metronome marks after it was published. But Beethoven was really excited about the metronome, and he was actually so excited that he actually gave like a public statement on the metronome, or the chronometer, which I think it was at the time. And I want to quote it here. It said as follows: Herr Beethoven looks upon this invention, the metronome, as a welcome means with which to secure the performance of his brilliant compositions in all places in the tempos conceived by him, which, to his regret, have so often been misunderstood. And I quote that at length, not just because it's hilarious, although I think it is, but because it also demonstrates several important points. We see first off that Beethoven felt like the metronome was a useful way to communicate the desired tempo for his piece. He second felt like it was extremely important that that tempo be correct, that the performers play his music at the tempo that was consistent with his intentions. And he also believed that his tempo markings, that the tempos that he wanted to use in his pieces, were not going to be intuitive. They were going to be counterintuitive. They were going to be prone to being misunderstood unless you had a specific guide in the form of that metronome mark. So you might say, so he says that to his regret, again, well, can't help but smile there a little bit, at least I can't, have been so often misunderstood. Which is to say that even when Beethoven was alive and when he could give performance feedback and make these corrections themselves, he was often finding that people didn't understand just on an intuitive level at what speed certain pieces were supposed to go. And this has been also the case in the centuries following Beethoven's death. And this movement, the first movement of the Fifth, is a perfect example of the most common problem that performers face when they're deciding on a tempo at which to play Beethoven's music, which is that the metronome mark that Beethoven gives is insanely fast. And virtually every performance that you've probably ever heard of the Fifth Symphony undershoots that mark by at least 10 or 20 beats per minute. There are a few exceptions to that. Most of them, including the most famous recordings by the most famous conductors, were generally going to be looking at a tempo that is significantly slower than Beethoven's written metronome mark. If you want to hear a performance of this movement at Beethoven's actual tempo, there's a recording that I would highly recommend. It's a recording by Benjamin Zander and the Philharmonia Orchestra. And Benjamin Zander is a conductor, and he does lectures on this sort of thing. He's sort of the guy who, watching him on YouTube and stuff, really introduced me to this idea and this conundrum of Beethoven's written metronome marks versus sort of the conventional traditional performances. And I would say that the way that the Fifth sounds with this tempo that's consistent with Beethoven's written marks is really the best argument that can be made in favor of interpreting that way. The performance speaks for itself. It's powerful, it's revelatory. Sorry, I think I've actually said that word wrong before in the past on this show already. But anyway, but this performance is in and of itself a compelling argument for the interpretation of the piece in that way. And it's a little different from what you might be used for. It's not as melodramatic as the version to which we're accustomed, but it is undeniably still dramatic and driven, and this highlights all the more aggressively the passion and the onward rush that are characteristic of Beethoven at his best. And so I highly recommend this recording. I would say that go check it out, and it's going to be a listening experience that will forever change the way that you hear the most famous four notes in music. Well, that's all for today. I hope you learned something from this, and I would again highly recommend the recording of this piece by Benjamin Zander and the Philharmonia Orchestra. And as always, please like, subscribe, share, and engage constructively. Emphasis on constructively. And see you tomorrow. Or actually, see you later today.